Oh man, I have no idea why I chose the hottest day of the year to record this video. Today we have like 36, 37 Celsius. But anyway, I have to do another video, which I didn't plan because I got this. So thanks to Geetus from Audio Status, which is a pain in my butt because of him I had to change my subwoofers. Now because of him I have to do another episode. He sent me this, which is a Dayton DATS LA. Now, for those that didn't get, that was sarcasm. I am super grateful because this thing was the thing that was missing from my testing bench and I always wanted it. Most of you probably know the Dayton DATS, little device that is used to measure impedance and TS parameters of speaker drivers. Very recently, just this, I think it was this year, Dayton released Dayton DATS LA, which is a device that can be summarized as a poor man's clipple. For those that don't know, a clipple is a measuring system that consists of a physical device and software that measures everything that you can of a speaker driver. That is, it measures all the electrical parameters such as BL, the motor force, and all the acoustical stuff. This thing is measuring all the electrical parameters, very similar to clipple. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that we cannot really directly compare measurements made by the clipple with measurements made by Dayton DATS LA because it is slightly different techniques how you can measure this. So basically what this thing is, it's a Dayton DATS that has a built-in 100 watt amplifier and it does measure TS parameters and it can plot all the symmetry curves. I'm not going to go into details what they are because this deserves a separate video. I might do a full review of this device. But in this video, we'll have a look at the BL curve, CMS curve, and very briefly, we're going to compare the TS parameters that I got using this device, which is a calibrated proper device, against what I measured in episode 2, I think, where I use my DIY jig and REW, and we will see what is the discrepancy and if my measurements were bad or you can measure TS parameters at home using REW. So very briefly, what are the symmetry curves? When we are measuring a speaker using a measuring microphone, we're measuring just literally just the output of the whole system, which is the baffle, box, or whatever, and the actual cone. Now, we have no idea what is happening inside the motor, and we have no idea how the suspension is working. In most cases, that is not important. What is important for an end user is the use case scenario, which is the actual acoustical output. But for this purpose, because we're diving very deep, we want to compare all of those 8-inch mid-bass drivers, how they are designed, the quality of their design. So when a speaker moves, it can go in and it can go out. Due to the physical construction of a speaker, any kind of a driver, you can have a little bit of offset where the coil is not in the actual center of the motor, or you can have a motor that is not optimized and it might have more BL in one side and a bit less on the other side. This Dayton DATS LA actually helps us to see if everything is centered, if everything is symmetrical. Exactly the same with the suspension. If you have a surround or a spider that is offset, that means that it might be put into the basket maybe 1 millimeter one way or 1 millimeter the other way, the performance of the suspension might not be symmetrical. As well, there's different kinds of suspensions where you have progressive spiders. That means the more you go in, the stiffer the spider becomes. There's many different details in regards to the CMS curve and the BL curve. Again, we're not going to go into great detail. What we're going to do in this video, we're just going to compare all of those 8 drivers that I have, and we'll just visually evaluate the curves, and we will see if any of them are very, very different from each other, if maybe something is very, very bad or something is very, very good. So again, I'm not going to show you how it works because I think I'm going to do a separate video. Gitis, thank you very much for this. The Rawcat channel really appreciates it. All of you viewers know that we will be measuring literally everything that I have with this thing. I want to measure my subwoofers, I want to measure the mid-ranges, and basically everything that I have, so we will go through all of them. But for now, we're going to compare all the drivers. So let's jump into the laptop. Okay, so for those that are not familiar, this is how the data and DATS software looks like. Here we have our impedance graph where the data and DATS software measures impedance at different Xmax using DC offset, but this is just details that doesn't really matter. Here on the side, we have our TS parameters measured with added mass method. If I'm gonna go to edit and open this, here we have all the full set of TS parameters. And here on the symmetry tab, we have the symmetry graphs, which in our case is cone excursion on the x-axis. So we have millimeters on the left and right. This is cone in and cone out, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 10 in both sides. And on y-axis, we can choose what we want. So we can have force factor, which is BL. So here you can see from the BL is measured 5.04, which is here at DC. And then depending on excursion, that BL goes down. It's not going to go up. And basically, this is where the Xmax, the industry standard Xmax comes from, because most manufacturers will add the details how their Xmax was measured. Most of the time is going to be 70% of BL. So you can see that this specific driver, in this case is the Aries, was measured like this, and the measurement stopped there because the amplifier doesn't have enough voltage to push this specific driver or many others, to be fair, to Xmax and beyond. So 100 watts is not sufficient. 100 watts is going to be plenty enough to measure 6.5-inch drivers or smaller ones. 8-inch drivers or bigger ones like subwoofers with this device is just simply not powerful enough. So we will have to kind of estimate where this graph goes. So you can see, for example, in this case, if we're going to extend this graph somewhere here, we have something like 7.2 millimeters at 70% BL. At 80% BL, we will have 6 millimeters. The second symmetry curve that we're going to have a look at is the CMS. So we have different ones. We have KMS, we have LE, which is inductance, FS, and we're going to have a look at the CMS curve. So where BL is the product of the motor force, the magnet, the CMS is the suspension, the spider, and the surround. So basically, this is how the suspension acts in this specific driver, where we have this plateau, which is like 1 millimeter plus minus. The suspension doesn't change. Ideally, and literally ideal case scenario, you would want this line to be flat. That means that doesn't matter what kind of excursion you have, the suspension acts the same. However, in this case, the more we go from the 0 point, the more excursion we have, the more the suspension is progressive. That means that it resists more and more the more you push the driver. This is a typical design of most speakers because you want to protect the speaker from bottoming out. So you make the suspension progressive. Otherwise, if it would be a totally flat line, it would be super easy to bottom out the driver and your coil would be slapping into the back plate and is going to be just warranty issues and issues and issues. So this is typical and normal. So again, we're going to have a look only at these two curves. Before that, I would like to, as I mentioned, compare some TS parameters just to see how this DATS measures, actually how my REW rig measures compared to this DATS. So I took just a couple of drivers. I didn't want to do all of them. I took the Helix, One Audio, and Aries. And you can stop this video and just compare to yourself. But to me, it is a little bit different, but it's close. Like for example, QTS, we can see 0.8, zero point 0.8, kind of the same. For the one audio, 0.6, 0.6, same. Aries, 0.775, kind of the same. FS is very, very close. You can see plus minus 1 hertz, and all the other ones are kind of similar. So for all intents and purposes, we can say that REW measures as good as Dayton DATS. The biggest discrepancy that you're gonna have is, if you're using the added mass method, is the actual added mass, because 1 gram of that added mass, the one that you have to enter into the software, will cause many parameters to shift. So plus minus half a gram discrepancy in the added mass will cause these discrepancies in all of these parameters. So now the graphs, we have 16 graphs, 8 for the CMS and 8 for the BL. And in the very beginning, I wanted to do like this comparison table and give like green and red for good and bad. But then I thought it's kind of really pointless, because for example, let me show you an example. 7 fidelity, I put both red because what I wanted to show, to compare, is the symmetry. So 7 fidelity BL. So if we look at this curve it's not really symmetrical, relatively speaking, compared to some other ones. For example, one audio, you can see one audio is much more symmetrical compared to the 7 fidelity. However, this symmetry does not matter, because you can see that BL here, the lowest BL, 82%, which is above the industry standard. Industry standard is 71. So 82 BL, we have 9.5 millimeters of excursion, X-max. So 70% would be probably close to 11 millimeters. So even if it is not really symmetrical, it doesn't matter, because it's not limited by BL. It can do much, much more. So that's why this, I'm gonna just leave it blank because it doesn't really matter. Now, the X-max. One little note that we cannot directly compare the X-max that is in the manual that's published by the manufacturer and the X-max that I measured with this Dayton DATS LA. Because some manufacturers, I do believe Stevens Audio, published in the manual the X-max not based on BL, but based on the coil height. Some manufacturers will publish 80% BL, most of them will do 70% BL, and the fact is that these graphs, the X-max is not measured, is estimated by the Dayton DATS software. In the Clipple, when you have Clipple measuring the device, the X-max, this one, is actually measured with a laser, so it is much more precise. So if we have one measurement measured with a laser, which is exact measurement, and this Dayton DATS data is estimated, and we have numbers that are slightly different, we cannot really compare them, because I cannot say that the Dayton DATS is 100% accurate. I cannot say that without using a laser. That is why we are not really gonna compare the manufacturer published X-max with what I measured. We are just gonna compare one with the other, because all of these drivers, even if this X-max is estimated, all of them will be measured under identical conditions with the same device. So we have 3 X-max thingies, which is X-max at 80% BL, at 71% BL, and at 50% CMS. These are kind of an industry standard. Most manufacturers will use 70% BL, because in most cases, it's like an industry cheat that in most cases, this will give you the biggest number. The lowest number, the lowest X-max is going to be based on 50% CMS, and you will never see any manufacturer publishing 50% CMS, because most of the time is going to be much lower than the 70% BL. And obviously, since everybody wants their product to look on paper as good as possible, they will always publish the biggest number. Ideally, you would want to look at 50% CMS and 82% BL. And the lower number of these two will be your X-Max. So let's have a look very quickly. We're going to start with Aries. This is how the BL curve looks like. It's not 100% symmetrical, but it's nice. Based on BL, we have about 6 millimeters of X-Max, 82%. 71% is going to be a little bit higher. And again, I will include this table so you can compare to yourself. So here we have Aries, we have 6 and 6.8. This is just an estimate. Then we have Helix. Helix shows a very, very symmetrical BL curve. Very, very little difference between left and right. So again, if you're not familiar with this, the solid line is the actual measurement and the dotted line is the mirror image of that, so that you would see what is the difference between left and right. Because if you would show only one curve, it's difficult to say if it's symmetrical or not. So the dotted line is just reverse image, but this is very, very nice curve. Then we have One Audio, again, very, very symmetrical curve, very, very nice. 7 Fidelity, not so symmetrical, but again, this driver has so much motor force and so much to spare that symmetry doesn't really matter. It's just literally overkill in the BL department. Stereo integrity, again, very, very symmetrical, very, very nice. Stevens is not really symmetrical, but again, it's plenty enough. So at 80%, we have here about close to 5 millimeters. 71% is about 6 millimeters. So it's fine. Then Sundown, again, not super symmetrical, but similar to 7 Fidelity, loads of BL to cover all the way up to like 8.5 millimeters. So if we're comparing Sundown and 7 Fidelity, 7 Fidelity has much more BL to probably last up to 10.5 millimeters. And Sundown is a little bit less. US Amps is the most non-symmetrical, and this can be kind of explained due to the offset. So here you can see that if we take this blue line and if we shift this 0 line somewhere here, 1 millimeter, that would be symmetrical, much, much more symmetrical. So we can say that the coil sits in the magnet 1 millimeter offset. If you would shift 1 millimeter, the coil itself, then it would be much more symmetrical. But even with this non-symmetrical response, we have at 70% BL, 5.8 millimeters of X-Max, which is again much more than it's claimed. In the manual, it's claimed 4.5, which is a bit less than 82% BL. 82% is like 4.6 millimeters. So yeah, it's plenty enough, plenty fine. Now the CMS, again, we're taking the CMS curve and I'm drawing a line at 50% CMS. And I do this by taking the CMS at 0 point, which is here 0.47 or something, and divide it in 2. And we have this line, and then we kind of draw a line here. So for this Aries driver is about 4.8 millimeters. And again, if we're coming back to this, Aries, there we go, CMS 50%, 4.8 millimeters. So this driver, the excursion is limited by the CMS. If the CMS, the suspension, would allow for more movement, then you would have a higher X-Max. And again, it's claimed 6.5 in the manual. 6 and 6.8, depending, again, it's not specified in the manual if it's 70 or 82%. So if it's 70%, it's just spot on, but the CMS is a bit lower compared to the manual. And the symmetry is very, very nice symmetrical. Now, the Helix. Helix exhibits the shape of the CMS curve almost ideal, because as I mentioned, you would want the CMS to be as flat as possible in as biggest range as possible. So it is flat, probably like 2.5 mil all the way up to 4, so plus minus 2.5 is kind of totally flat, and then the suspension tightens up, again, just to prevent the driver from bottoming out. And based on the CMS, we have an X-Max of 7 and a bit millimeters. If we're coming back to this Helix, 6.8 on the BL, 8 on the 70 BL and 7.2 on the CMS. It is claimed 7.8, so again, we measured a little bit less depending on which BL was used. So we can say 7.2, 7.8 is very, very close. And as always, Helix specs match. But again, I'm very cautious to compare the published data with the measured data because they're measured on two different devices. However, the actual shape is textbook how it's supposed to be. Now, one audio, the suspension looks to be a little bit offset again, and it tightens fast and a lot. So based on this, we have only 3.5 millimeters of X-Max based on CMS. So I think the one audio has the biggest discrepancy between published and measured. It's published about 6.2 millimeters, and I measured 3.5, 4 millimeters only. So much less. Based on what I measured, the one audio has the least X-Max from all the drivers. The other driver that has kind of lowish X-Max is the Stereo Integrity and Stevens audio. And again, it's kind of expected because this is, I don't want to call it a pro audio driver, but it's supposed to have low sensitivity. So let's come back to this. Symmetry is not that good and tightens up very, very fast. 7 fidelity, again, not very symmetrical. However, is just plenty of the CMS. So we have on the lowest here about 7.2 millimeters, which is again plenty enough. If the suspension would be offset by like 1 millimeter, we would have much better symmetry and technically more X-Max. Then stereo integrity, I couldn't push this driver to 50% CMS because it has a tight suspension and it needs a lot of power. So from all these measured drivers, you can see that Aries went past the 50% because it is rated 60 watts and it doesn't need a lot of power. It has a very soft suspension. This driver I could barely measure it. One audio, yes, a little bit more. 7 fidelity, I measured past it. But stereo integrity needs much more than 100 watts to reach X-Max. So if you have stereo integrity and you have a 150 watt amplifier, you're not going to bottom it out no matter what. However, the symmetry, look at the symmetry. The difference between the dotted line and the solid line is almost non-existent. That means that this driver, suspension of this driver is ideally symmetrical, which is the best from all of the drivers. Aries is close, but this one is literally spot on, super symmetrical. Stevens audio, a little bit offset, and again, very tight suspension, tightens up as fast as one audio. Sundown, there is a little bit of symmetry, again, 1 millimeter to the side. It would be better. And we have about 6 millimeters on 50% CMS. And US amps symmetry, to me, it looks close to stereo integrity. Not as good, but almost perfect as well. And one thing to note is that US amps, based on CMS, it has 7 millimeters. So with the US amps, if we have a look at this, the suspension allows for much more excursion, X-Max, compared to the BL. BL is the limiting factor because, if we're coming back to this, it's asymmetrical. So if it would be symmetrical, the BL curve, if there would be a bit offset of the coil, we would have probably close to 7 millimeters of X-Max based on both 70% BL and CMS. So US amps claiming in the manual 4.5 millimeters, they claim less than 80% BL, which is basically way underrating their driver. The US amps timbre is capable more than the manual is claimed, and I don't know, to me, it looks like typical of Michael that he underrates his amplifiers, and in this case, underrated this driver. This driver, based on my test, can do close to 6 millimeters, which is like probably almost 20% more than it's claimed, 6 millimeters of X-Max. And based on that, if we're coming back to this, what I measured, and I measured this VD, these numbers were based on the manufacturer's published data, but now it's a little bit changed. So now we know that US amps can do much more than it is claimed. Stereo integrity is very similar to what is claimed, a little bit less. I have 5.6 and 5.8, so a bit more than 1 millimeter, 1.3, 1.4 millimeters less than it is in the manual. Sundown, based on BL, is perfectly fine. The CMS tightens up a little bit. My thought about this is that Jacob is making drivers that would be hard to bottom out because they know that people will be abusing them. So he makes the suspension progressive to tighten up. So based on this is 6 millimeters more like, but if you can push it more, if you can give it power, the BL is not limited really. Stevens audio, again, is very difficult. I took this 5.5, 6 millimeters from the manual because it's very confusing what is written in the manual. I think in the manual, the half coil size was written as 4 millimeters. So if the X-Max is claimed at 4 millimeters, this driver does 5, close to 5. So more than the manual. 7 fidelity, again, similar to Sundown, where the suspension tightens up. So it's limited at 7 millimeters. The BL is allowing more. So technically, if you want more excursion, he would need to work on the suspension to allow it a bit more, a couple of millimeters more, or just put a smaller motor because that is just totally overkill. Aries is, again, limited by suspension, about 5 millimeters, which is fine. One audio, a bit low on the X-Max, 3.5, 4 millimeters, the lowest from them all. And Helix is literally, to me, it looks spot on as the manual, almost ideal. So if we're looking at these only, and we're looking at output, one audio is going to have the least output. 7 fidelity is going to have the most output, more than the Sundown. Even if in the manual both are claimed 9 and 9, on the test bench, 7 fidelity does 1.2 millimeters more than the Sundown. So 7 fidelity is the output king. Now again, I will upload all of these graphs, all of these tables under the video. You can find the link in the video description. You can have a look at them by yourselves and just to see what you see. But it was very, very fun for me to analyze this. Next video is going to be a summary. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.